on when does something become a classic, whether you're talking about a book or a movie or a piece of art. And there's always going to be a bit of arbitrariness when it comes to answering this question because everyone will have their own timeline for when they think something is appropriate to become a classic, in terms of years. Now, obviously, a classic isn't just something that's old. It's something that stood the test of time, something that people still remember and go back to. Well, to me, in order for something to be considered a classic, it must be at least 20 years old because that's one generation. And if people are still talking about it after one generation, then it must have some kind of special quality. However, I think that probably if something is 20 years old, the term modern classic is more appropriate because sometimes you'll have people will become nostalgic for something that they grew up with, which usually happens around 20, sometimes 30 years later. The a sign of a true classic is something that people who didn't grow up with it that they still value it. If a book's being read or a movie's being seen by people who aren't nostalgic for it, but it's something that's been passed down to them, that's the sign of a true classic. And so, in that way, I think in order for something to be considered a true classic, it must be at least 40 years old because if something's stood the test of time through several generations, then that's when you can consider it to be a true classic. 20 years, you could maybe use the term modern classic, but to me, 40 years is probably when something can be considered a classic. Of course, there's always going to be a bit of arbitrariness in this. Like, for example, does that mean something isn't a classic if it's 38 years or 39 years old? So there's some arbitrariness, but in general, to me, in order for something to be considered a true classic, it has to be at least 40 years. In order for it to be maybe considered a modern classic, it has to be at least 20 years old.